It was a peaceful autumn afternoon in Bellwood Estates, a gated community known for its pristine lawns and luxury homes. 14-year-old Jamal Carter, a bright and ambitious high school freshman, was riding his bike home from basketball practice. The shortcut through Maple Drive saved him 10 minutes, a route he had taken countless times before. He had just stopped to check his phone when the sound of hurried footsteps broke the silence. Across the street, Victoria Langford stood with her arms crossed, her piercing blue eyes locked on Jamal. The 52-year-old socialite had lived in Bellwood for over 2 decades, priding herself on keeping the neighborhood exclusive. She reached for her phone, dialing 911 with practiced ease. "There's a suspicious individual in our neighborhood," she reported. "A black teen in a hoodie. I don't feel safe." Jamal barely had time to process the woman's hostile gaze before red and blue lights filled the street. 2 police cruisers skidded to a stop, doors flying open as officers stepped out, hands hovering near their weapons. "Hands where we can see them," one officer barked. Jamal's heart pounded as he slowly raised his hands, his basketball bag slipping off his shoulder onto the pavement. Victoria Langford smirked from her doorstep, confident she had done her civic duty. "I caught him trying to break into a house," she declared. "I saw him looking around suspiciously." Jamal tried to explain, his voice shaking. "I live in this neighborhood. I was just passing through." The officers exchanged skeptical glances. Then, one of them reached for his radio. "We need backup," he said grimly. "Call his parents. Before we dive deeper into the story, let us know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments." Miles away in her downtown office, attorney Olivia Carter was preparing for an important civil rights case when her phone rang. The moment she heard the officer's voice, her stomach twisted into a knot. Her son had been detained. Without hesitation, she grabbed her coat and rushed to her car, driving faster than she ever had before. By the time she arrived at Maple Drive, the scene was even worse than she had imagined. Jamal stood in the street, hands still raised, while officers surrounded him. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Olivia's presence was immediate and commanding as she stepped out of the car. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. Victoria Langford, still standing on her porch, crossed her arms with a satisfied smirk. "I called them. He was loitering and looking into houses." Olivia's eyes blazed. "My son lives here, and you had no right to assume otherwise." Turning to the officers, she asked, "Has he been charged with anything?" One officer hesitated. "No, ma'am, but we had a report." "That's not probable cause," Olivia snapped, pulling out her phone. "And if you lay one more hand on him without just cause, I will personally see to it that this department is held accountable." The officers shifted uncomfortably. Finally, one of them sighed and gestured for Jamal to lower his hands. "He's free to go," he muttered. But Olivia wasn't finished. She turned back to Victoria. "This isn't over," she said, her voice steely. "You will answer for this." Victoria only smirked, unaware that her world was about to unravel. The next morning, Olivia wasted no time. She called her legal team and arranged a press conference. Standing in front of a row of cameras, she held up a printed image of her son, standing terrified with his hands raised. "This," she said, her voice strong, "is what racial profiling looks like." Reporters murmured as she continued. "Victoria Langford, a woman of influence in this community, falsely accused my son of a crime he did not commit. We are filing a civil suit against her for defamation, false allegations, and racial discrimination. It's time this country confronts the reality of implicit bias." Victoria watched the press conference from her home, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass. She had assumed Olivia would be just another angry mother making empty threats. She hadn't expected a full-fledged legal battle. "That woman thinks she can drag my name through the mud," she muttered under her breath. "We'll see about that." The battle lines had been drawn. Victoria wasn't about to let Olivia control the narrative. The following day, she arranged her own interview with a conservative news outlet. "This is nothing more than an attack on law-abiding citizens," she declared. "I feared for my safety. That boy could have been anyone. The interview sparked a firestorm of debate. Some viewers sympathized with Victoria, believing her to be a frightened homeowner protecting her property. Others saw through her facade, recognizing the coded language of racial bias. Meanwhile, Jamal's case gained traction online. Hashtags like #JusticeForJamal and #racial profiling trended on social media. Olivia's law firm received an influx of emails from families who had faced similar experiences. This wasn't just about Jamal anymore. This was about a systemic issue that had gone unchecked for too long. Victoria soon found herself drowning in scrutiny. News anchors dissected her background, revealing a history of questionable complaints against black residents. The walls were closing in. As the media frenzy intensified, Olivia faced an onslaught of both support and backlash. Her inbox was flooded with messages, some praising her bravery, others filled with hate and vitriol. Protesters gathered outside Bellwood Estates, demanding justice for Jamal, while counter-protesters, waving signs that read, "Protect our neighborhoods," stood in opposition. Jamal, meanwhile, struggled to adjust to his sudden notoriety. At school, whispers followed him in the hallways. Some classmates praised him for standing up, while others avoided him entirely. Teachers, unsure of how to navigate the situation, treated him with forced neutrality. He had never wanted this kind of attention. He just wanted to be a kid. Olivia, sensing her son's unease, sat beside him one evening. "I know this is hard," she said gently, "but we have to keep pushing. This isn't just about us anymore." Jamal sighed. "I get it, Mom. I do. But what if we lose? What if nothing changes?" Olivia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Then we fight harder. No matter what happens, we are telling the truth, and the truth has power." Across town, Victoria seethed as her social circle began to shrink. Friends who once flocked to her extravagant dinner parties now avoided her calls. Even the Bellwood Homeowners Association distanced themselves, wary of the growing controversy. With her reputation crumbling, Victoria decided to take drastic action. She called her lawyer. "I want to countersue for defamation," she said firmly. "I won't let that woman destroy me." The battle was far from over. The next week, Olivia received an official notice. Victoria had filed a countersuit for defamation. Olivia wasn't surprised, but the sheer audacity of it made her blood boil. She gathered her legal team for an emergency meeting. "This is a scare tactic," one of her colleagues said. "She wants to intimidate you into backing down." "She picked the wrong woman to intimidate," Olivia replied. "We're pressing forward." The courtroom drama was beginning to unfold. Both lawsuits were making their way through the legal system, with hearings scheduled within weeks of each other. Media coverage exploded, turning the case into a national debate about race, privilege, and justice. Talk shows, podcasts, and opinion pieces dissected every detail, fueling an already volatile situation. Meanwhile, Victoria's lawyer, a seasoned litigator with a reputation for aggressive tactics, advised her to appear remorseful in public. "Your best move is to show regret," he told her. "The court of public opinion matters." But Victoria refused to play the part. "I'm not apologizing for protecting my home," she snapped. Instead, she doubled down, making more public statements about the so-called dangers of outsiders in Bellwood Estates. Her words only deepened the divide, galvanizing both her supporters and detractors. Jamal, caught in the whirlwind, tried to focus on his schoolwork, but the stress was overwhelming. Late one night, as he scrolled through hateful comments online, Olivia found him slumped over his desk. "Enough of that," she said gently, closing his laptop. "We are not defined by what they say. We define ourselves." As the legal battle loomed, Olivia knew this fight was bigger than just one case. It was about challenging an entire system built on prejudice, and she wasn't backing down. The next week, Olivia received an official notice. Victoria had filed a countersuit for defamation. Olivia wasn't surprised, but the sheer audacity of it made her blood boil. She gathered her legal team for an emergency meeting. "This is a scare tactic," one of her colleagues said. "She wants to intimidate you into backing down." "She picked the wrong woman to intimidate," Olivia replied. "We're pressing forward." The courtroom drama was beginning to unfold. Both lawsuits were making their way through the legal system, with hearings scheduled within weeks of each other. Media coverage exploded, turning the case into a national debate about race, privilege, and justice. Talk shows, podcasts, and opinion pieces dissected every detail, fueling an already volatile situation. Meanwhile, Victoria's lawyer, a seasoned litigator with a reputation for aggressive tactics, advised her to appear remorseful in public. "Your best move is to show regret," he told her. "The court of public opinion matters." But Victoria refused to play the part. "I'm not apologizing for protecting my home," she snapped. Instead, she doubled down, making more public statements about the so-called dangers of outsiders in Bellwood Estates. Her words only deepened the divide, galvanizing both her supporters and detractors. Jamal, caught in the whirlwind, tried to focus on his schoolwork, but the stress was overwhelming. Late one night, as he scrolled through hateful comments online, Olivia found him slumped over his desk. "Enough of that," she said gently, closing his laptop. "We are not defined by what they say. We define ourselves." As the legal battle loomed, Olivia knew this fight was bigger than just one case. It was about challenging an entire system built on prejudice. And she wasn't backing down. The day of the first court hearing arrived under a gray, overcast sky. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, some chanting for justice, others defending Victoria's right to call the police as she saw fit. The tension in the air was thick, a stark reflection of the deep divide that had formed in the community. Inside, Olivia sat beside her lawyer, her fingers clasped tightly together. Across the aisle, Victoria exuded defiance, her posture rigid as she conferred with her legal team. When the judge entered, the courtroom fell silent. "Mrs. Langford's countersuit claims that your allegations have caused irreparable harm to her reputation and well-being." The judge began, directing his gaze at Olivia's attorney. "How does the plaintiff respond?" Olivia's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, the truth is not defamation. Mrs. Langford's actions were documented and corroborated. Our suit stands on the principle that racial profiling has real consequences, and we intend to prove that in this court." The hearing was procedural, a step in the long battle ahead, but as Olivia and Jamal exited the courthouse, reporters swarmed them. "Do you have any comments on the countersuit?" One shouted. Olivia met the cameras head-on. "This isn't about reputation. It's about justice. And we are not afraid." That night, Olivia's words dominated the news cycle. While some praised resolve, others saw it as arrogance. Online debates raged. Victoria's supporters rallied around her, claiming she was being vilified for protecting her home. Olivia's supporters called out the systemic racism that had led to Jamal's wrongful detainment. As the trial date drew closer, both families felt the weight of the impending battle. Olivia prepared for depositions, reviewing every detail of Jamal's case, while Victoria fought to maintain the crumbling support of her affluent peers. Every move was scrutinized, every action dissected. Then, an unexpected development shook the case. A security camera from a nearby business captured the moment Victoria confronted Jamal. The footage showed Jamal standing on the sidewalk, nowhere near a property, looking at his phone. Victoria approached him first, pointing aggressively before making the call to the police. There was no sign of a threat, only fear-mongering. When the footage leaked, the public reaction was swift and unforgiving. News stations played the video on repeat. Hashtags condemning Victoria flooded social media. Even some of her staunchest supporters began to waver. Inside her home, Victoria watched the news in horror, her carefully crafted defense crumbling before her eyes. She threw the remote across the room, frustration boiling over. "They've turned me into a villain," she hissed. But deep down, for the first time, doubt crept in. Meanwhile, Olivia sat with Jamal, watching the footage together. He exhaled shakily. "So this proves it. I wasn't imagining things." "No, baby," Olivia said softly. "You never were." The tide was turning, but the fight was far from over. In the days following the release of security footage, public sentiment shifted dramatically. News commentators dissected every frame, highlighting how Victoria had approached Jamal first, not the other way around. Prominent civil rights activists and legal experts weighed in, calling for harsher consequences for false accusations that endangered black lives. Victoria's legal team scrambled to control the damage. They issued a statement claiming the video had been taken out of context and that Victoria had genuinely felt threatened. But the damage was done. The footage spoke louder than words, and people weren't buying her justifications anymore. Meanwhile, Olivia and her team gained even more momentum. Calls flooded her office from other families who had experienced similar injustices. National organizations reached out, offering their support. What had started as one mother's fight for her son was quickly becoming a movement. Despite the mounting pressure, Victoria refused to back down. She doubled down on her stance, appearing on a conservative talk show to paint herself as the true victim. "This is a witch hunt," she said, her voice trembling with carefully measured emotion. "My family has received threats. My children are terrified, all because I tried to protect my community." Jamal watched the interview with his mother, his hands clenched into fists. "She's still lying," he muttered, "even when the truth is right in front of her." Olivia placed a calming hand on his shoulder. "People like her always find a way to twist reality," she said. "But the truth is out now, and it's stronger than her lies." As the court date loomed, Victoria's legal strategy became clear: stall, deflect, and discredit. But Olivia wasn't going to let that happen. She was ready to take the fight to the next level, where the truth could no longer be ignored. With the trial date approaching, Olivia and her team spent long nights preparing. Every detail mattered. They compiled witness testimonies, expert opinions on racial bias, and community support statements. Olivia knew Victoria's legal team would do everything in their power to shift the narrative, and she refused to let them rewrite the truth. Meanwhile, Victoria met with her attorneys in her spacious home, frustration evident in her sharp tone. "We need to discredit them," she insisted. "Find anything on Olivia Carter, anything at all. If we can prove she has an agenda, we can control the media spin." Her lead attorney nodded. "We're working on it. We've also filed motions to delay the trial. If we keep this in limbo long enough, the public will lose interest." But Olivia anticipated their tactics. At a press conference outside the courthouse, she called them out directly. "Delays won't change the facts. My son was falsely accused, and the world saw the evidence. No amount of legal games will erase that." The pressure intensified. Social media remained ablaze with discussions about racial injustice. More activists rallied behind Jamal, ensuring the case wouldn't fade into the background. A well-known civil rights attorney even reached out to offer additional legal expertise pro bono. Victoria felt the walls closing in. For the first time, she realized this might not go away quietly. Her once loyal friends started distancing themselves, hesitant to be associated with her now toxic reputation. Jamal, though still nervous about the trial, found strength in the support around him. "They can delay," he told his mother one night, "but they can't run from the truth." Olivia nodded. "Exactly. And we're going to make sure they hear it loud and clear in that courtroom." The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, and curious onlookers filled the benches, eager to witness the trial that had gripped the nation. Olivia sat beside her legal team, her expression composed but firm. Jamal sat behind her, his fingers clenched together in his lap. Victoria Langford arrived in a tailored navy suit, her usual air of confidence slightly diminished. Her attorneys whispered last-minute instructions as the judge entered, calling the court to order. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the facts. They played the body cam footage of Jamal's wrongful detainment, the fear in his eyes undeniable. The lead prosecutor turned to the jury. "This is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern, one that must be addressed." Victoria's attorney countered with a defense built on fear and justification. "My client acted in good faith. She saw a suspicious individual in a private community. She did what any responsible citizen would do." Then came Olivia's moment. She stood and walked to the jury, her voice measured yet powerful. "This is not about safety. This is about perception. A black teenager on a bike was seen as a threat, not because of his actions, but because of his skin color. This is why we are here today." Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her seat. For the first time, it seemed the weight of her actions had truly dawned on her. As the first witnesses were called, the trial was officially underway. The first witness called to the stand was Officer Gregson, one of the responding officers the night of the incident. The prosecutor approached him, a sharp focus in her gaze. "Officer Gregson, when you arrived at the scene, what did you observe?" Gregson hesitated before answering. "I saw a young black male standing near a residence." Ms. Langford was visibly upset, and she claimed he was attempting to break in. The prosecutor nodded. "And did you have any reason to believe this was true?" Gregson sighed. "No, the boy wasn't doing anything illegal. He had a basketball bag, and he was standing next to his bike." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Olivia stole a glance at Victoria, whose jaw had tightened. The defense attorney rose for cross-examination. "Officer Gregson, isn't it true that in high-crime areas, police are trained to respond swiftly to suspicious activity?" Gregson shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, but Bellwood Estates is not a high-crime area." Jamal watched, his heart pounding as more witnesses took the stand. A neighbor testified that Jamal often rode through the neighborhood without issue. Another recounted how Victoria had a history of calling the police on black delivery drivers. Finally, Jamal himself was called to stand. He swallowed hard as he approached, the weight of the moment pressing on him. When asked to describe what happened that day, he spoke clearly. "I was just checking my phone. I wasn't trespassing. But the moment she saw me, I knew she didn't see a kid. She saw a threat." His words hung heavy in the air. Even Victoria, for a brief second, looked unsure of herself. On the third day of the trial, the moment many had been waiting for arrived, Victoria Langford was called to testify. Dressed in a conservative gray suit, she walked to the witness stand with practiced poise. But Olivia could see the tension in her shoulders. The prosecutor approached. "Ms. Langford, can you explain why you called 911 that night?" Victoria folded her hands neatly in her lap. "I believed I saw someone suspicious. I have a right to protect my home and community." The prosecutor nodded. "And what exactly was suspicious about Jamal Carter?" Victoria hesitated. He was standing near a house, looking around." The prosecutor pressed on. "So, you assumed he was dangerous because he was standing and looking around? Or was it because he was black?" A sharp gasp came from the audience. Victoria's face paled. I would have reacted the same way if he were white." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because multiple witnesses have testified that you've called the police on black individuals before, but never on white teenagers. How do you explain that?" Victoria fumbled for words, but the damage was done. The jury saw it. The spectators saw it. And for the first time, the weight of accountability pressed heavily on her. Olivia watched for her seat, her expression unreadable. The truth was unfolding, piece by piece. And Victoria Langford, one so sure of her control, was running out of places to hide. As Victoria stepped down from the witness stand, murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Jurors exchanged glances, their expressions betraying a mix of skepticism and discomfort. They had seen the hesitation in her responses, the cracks in her composed facade. The prosecution wasted no time. "Your Honor, we'd like to call Detective Marcus Rowe to the stand." A tall, broad-shouldered officer in uniform approached. He had been one of the responding officers that day, and his report had become a key piece of evidence. The prosecutor began. "Detective Rowe, when you arrived at the scene, what was Jamal Carter doing?" Rowe cleared his throat, standing with his hands raised. He looked terrified. "And did he appear to be committing any crime?" "No, ma'am. In fact, after reviewing security footage from nearby houses, it was clear he was simply checking his phone." A wave of tension rolled through the courtroom. The prosecutor turned toward the jury. "There you have it. A teenager, minding his own business, profiled and accused because of his race." Victoria shifted uncomfortably. Olivia watched the jury's reactions. Some leaned forward, absorbing every word. Others nodded slightly. The truth was sinking in. The next day, the defense scrambled to regain control. Victoria's lead attorney, Mr. Garson, called their own witness, an expert on neighborhood crime statistics. The man droned on about recent break-ins and the need for vigilance. But the prosecution was ready. When cross-examining, Olivia's co-counsel cut to the argument swiftly. "So, Mr. Lambert, Are you saying Victoria Langford had legitimate reason to suspect Jamal Carter? The expert hesitated. I'm saying there were previous incidents. Were any of the perpetrators in those incidents black teenagers wearing hoodies like Jamal? Lambert flipped through his notes, his face reddening. I don't have that data. But you assumed, the attorney pressed, that this case fits that pattern? Silence. The jury took in the moment. The evidence was undeniable. Victoria had acted on bias, not logic, and no statistical argument could erase the injustice Jamal had faced. That evening, Olivia sat with her son outside the courthouse. We're close, Jamal. They're running out of defenses. Jamal exhaled, the weight on his chest feeling lighter. I just want this to mean something, Mom. She smiled softly, touching his hand. It already does. The trial resumed with a shift in momentum. Olivia's team called surprise witness, a former housekeeper, Victoria Langford's, who had resigned years ago due to mistreatment. The woman, Maria Delgado, took the stand, her voice steady but firm. I worked for Mrs. Langford for 5 years. Maria testified. I saw how she treated people who didn't look like her. She would call security on black delivery drivers for no reason. She even told me once to watch out for certain kind of kids in the neighborhood. Victoria's attorneys objected, but the judge allowed Maria's testimony. The impact was immediate. Her words painted a damning picture of Victoria's long-standing prejudices. The jury took notes. The gallery murmured. Victoria, sitting at the defense table, felt her pulse quicken. Her carefully curated image was crumbling before her eyes. The prosecution delivered another blow, playing an audio clip from a neighbor's home security camera. The recording captured Victoria's voice clearly. I know their kind. They don't belong here. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The weight of her own words settled over the jury like a heavy fog. Olivia leaned toward her co-counsel. We got her. Victoria's lawyer scrambled for damage control. That evening, she appeared on a televised interview, her makeup flawless but her voice tight with stress. This entire case is a character assassination, she claimed. I'm not a racist. I was simply protecting my home and my neighborhood. But the public wasn't buying it. Social media dissected her words, comparing her statements to the damning evidence presented in court. News outlets replayed the audio clip, fueling the firestorm. Meanwhile, Jamal found himself at the center of national attention. Invitations for interviews flooded in. Celebrities, activists, and even politicians voiced support for him. But Olivia remained focused. We're not here for fame, she reminded her son. We're here for justice. As the trial neared its end, Victoria's once confident demeanor began to crack. Even her own legal team seemed to be losing faith. She had spent years believing she was untouchable. Now she wasn't so sure. In a quiet moment before court the next morning, Victoria stared at her reflection in the courthouse bathroom mirror. Her face looked different, tired, worn. For the first time in her life, she understood what it felt like to be truly afraid. The verdict was coming, and there was nowhere left to hide. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in. Every eye was on them. Olivia clutched Jamal's hand, her pulse pounding. Victoria sat stiffly, her expression unreadable. The foreperson stood. In the case of the state versus Victoria Langford, on the charge of false accusation with malicious intent, we find the defendant guilty. A sharp gasp echoed through the room. Olivia felt a rush of relief, tears welling in her eyes. Jamal squeezed her hand, his own breath shaking. Victoria's face paled. Her attorneys whispered frantically, but she barely registered their words. The judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing date. Outside, supporters erupted into cheers. Olivia and Jamal stepped into the sunlight, surrounded by a wave of people chanting his name. We did it, Jamal whispered. Olivia pulled him close. No, son, you did it. Months later, Olivia stood before a crowd at a community event dedicated to racial justice. She looked out the faces, some familiar, some new, all inspired by Jamal's fight. This isn't just about one case, she said. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what my son did. Jamal joined her, now confident and self-assured. We still have work to do, he said. But we've proven that when we stand together, we can make a difference." The crowd erupted in applause. As Olivia looked at her son, she knew this was only the beginning. As the weeks passed, the momentum of Jamal's case grew beyond anything Olivia had imagined. The story had reached every corner of the country, sparking discussions in schools, workplaces, and government offices. New policies were being proposed to hold individuals accountable for false accusations based on race. The media continued to follow Jamal's journey, but Olivia knew this wasn't about just one boy. It was about changing a system that had failed too many before him. One afternoon, Olivia sat in their living room scrolling through messages from strangers who had been inspired by their fight. Some shared their own experiences with racial profiling. Others simply offered words of support. One message stood out. "Because of your son, I finally had the courage to speak up about what happened to me. Thank you for not giving up." Tears pricked Olivia's eyes. She looked over at Jamal, who was helping organize an upcoming community forum. He had grown into a young man with a purpose, no longer defined by what happened to him, but by what he chose to do in response. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was a local congresswoman who had taken an interest in their case. "Olivia, Jamal," she said, stepping inside. "There's something I'd like to discuss with you both. We're working on a new initiative to prevent racial profiling in policing and everyday life, and we want you involved." Jamal exchanged a glance with his mother. "What would that mean?" "It means taking what you've started and turning it into real, lasting change," the congresswoman said. "Public awareness is powerful, but laws and policies, those make a difference." Olivia smiled. "Then let's get to work." 1 year after the trial, Olivia and Jamal stood before a much larger crowd than before. This wasn't just a community gathering. It was a national conference on racial justice. Activists, educators, and leaders from across the country had come together, united by a common goal. As Olivia stepped up to the podium, she took a deep breath. "A year ago, my son was accused of something he didn't do," she began. "And while we won the courtroom, the real victory is what we've built since then. This movement isn't about revenge. It's about making sure justice isn't a privilege, but a right for everyone." Jamal took the microphone. "We've learned that change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen when people refuse to stay silent. It happens when we challenge the systems that fail us and replace them with something better. This is only the beginning." The crowd erupted in applause, but Olivia knew the work wasn't finished. As long as injustice existed, their fight would continue. But now they weren't alone. They were part of something bigger, something that would outlive them all. Your voice matters. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Continue the conversation, take action, and stand against injustice. Subscribe, comment, like, and share this message.